Eli Roth is one of the most unique horror filmmakers that nobody ever talks about, although I've always found him to be a bit of an enigma when it comes to the genre because, on the one hand, he has this extremely intelligent perspective on the genre as both a form of artistic expression and commentary, which are values I hold very close to my heart because they're usually overshadowed by this vapid cultural emphasis on sensationalism. But, on the other hand, I've never entirely found his filmmaking efforts to live up to anything as masterful as his caliber of inspirations ranging from Wes Craven to Tobe Hooper to Quentin Tarantino. That said, I think he gets an unfairly hard time with critics for his creative ambitions and style of storytelling, even if I do agree that yes, his intentions are sometimes ignorant and woefully misguided in the context of modern sensibilities. My best summary of Eli Roth is that he's a 21st century filmmaker trying to replicate and arguably revive the provocative culture of 60s, 70s exploitation cinema, and for as puerile and insensitive as many critics have perceived his work, every single one of his films, excluding that weird family film that he made recently, can be traced back to the roots of a deeply taboo and uncomfortable subject matter founded during the exploitation era that we're socially long past by this point. Hell, one could argue he's actually one of the braver horror filmmakers still out there, with his uncompromising vision for a seedy, unspoken reality that goes into physical and emotional territories the vast majority of us would rather steer clear from. His style is very niche, to say the least. In fact, after his debut feature Cabin Fever, a sort of B-movie body horror homage to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Last House on the Left, and Evil Dead, one of his biggest influences, Quentin Tarantino, called him the future of horror. So much so that Tarantino very enthusiastically lent his name to Roth's next film, which also became his most controversial. This was HOSTEL. For the uninitiated, let me clarify one point before we go any further. HOSTEL is nowhere near as violent as many people would have you believe. Yes, it's supremely disturbing in its bone-chilling context, and when it does show you something, it is repulsively gruesome in its attention to detail. But for a large portion of the movie, there really isn't a whole lot shown on screen. Instead, HOSTEL plays almost exclusively on teasing your imagination with agonizing visuals, when in reality, much of the film's terror is carried by its penetrative sound design and atmosphere to accentuate the torture that's happening mostly behind closed doors. You learn everything you need to know in its subtle, morbid opening credits that set up the tone for the film perfectly, with someone cheerfully whistling while washing the blood and gore in an isolated room, perpetuating this impending dread and hopelessness through a twistedly sinister contrast between an unseen, unpleasant suffering and the killer's casual delight, with the title HOSTEL simply reflecting in a puddle, foreshadowing the film's heavy emphasis on deception. It's actually comparative to Rhys Orlini's score during the peaceful scenic shots in the opening of Cannibal Holocaust, which, side note of no surprise, Roth would more or less reimagine in his own Mondo homage, The Green Inferno, almost a decade later. In Cannibal Holocaust, it's supposed to reflect the motive behind the madness, in that the media present this murder documentary crew like martyrs to a tribe's savagery, yet when context is applied, the crew are discovered to be just as barbaric that triggered the conflict in the first place. It comes back to this idea that things are usually just too good to be true, like the sexual fantasy the protagonists of HOSTEL find themselves in. Although, before we dive into the rest of the film, let's address the major misconception behind it. While Roth's style comes close to Texas Chainsaw meets Last House on the Left with a cheeky bit of Reservoir Dogs on the side, the former two films of which he was actually offered to remake following Cabin Fever's success at the box office, there were many hypocritical media outlets and detesters who compared HOSTEL as being Roth's attempt to capitalize on Saw's explosive success at the box office from the year before, a film that had been both fiercely beloved and torn apart by critics and audiences for supposedly helping to instigate and popularize the notorious torture porn subgenre that surfaced partly as a result to this spike in new French extremity cinema, despite creators James Wan and Lee Whannell openly disputing that they never intended to do so. In fact, very much like Hostel, Saw is not even all that violent either, considering most of the movie is set in the aftermath of each death, or distorted by the hyperactive editing style and dark saturated colours and lighting. But since the media got so caught up in the sensationalism of its graphic concept of traps, torture and body horror, naturally they misunderstood and misrepresented its intriguing mystery thriller. Oh, and let's not forget that the studio-controlled sequel sure as hell did not help at all, as they basically played into the shallowness of the controversy, embraced their sadistic label, and sidelined Wan and Wenel's artistic vision. Anyway, before I get sucked down that cultural rabbit hole, avoiding an indirect comparison, Hostel presented audiences with a genuinely horrifying premise that did have spiritual similarities to Saw, in that what if it was very much possible that a secret underground torture society could, and hell, might even exist. Granted, while there is a certain suspension of disbelief to Saw with its pseudo-philosophical villain and arbitrary trap setups, Hostel completely bypasses even having a main villain. There is no face given to this organization. It's only in the final act of the story do we learn anything about what's happening, and even then it relies on you paying attention to clues and details in the background. It doesn't hold your hand, there is no exposition or character out there explaining or summarizing what's going on. There's a sort of day-in-the-life nature to putting us in the perspective of admittedly very shitty characters who have no significance to anything happening in the world. It essentially establishes them as just another careless group of victims, completely oblivious to their ignorance and disrespect for other countries and cultures. Cynically speaking, they're just these typical douchebag backpackers who exude this arrogance everywhere they go. Roth writes his American characters from a mildly stereotypical perspective. Put it this way, you know the way other countries scorn Americans for their abrasive behaviour? Well, there's kind of a bit of vicious truth to it, and that can be said about how the American characters perceive the places they visit as having their own negative traits as well. In fact, Roth even had to defend his intentions when Slovakia and Czech Republic, the former being where the film is set and the latter being where it was shot, thought his portrayal of their countries as violent, crime-infested and underdeveloped to be in poor taste, with Slovakia even inviting him on an all-expenses-paid trip to visit their country to protect their image, even though these kinds of hostile places exist in every country, so there's nothing new there. Roth states that his choice to set the film in Europe was down to a real, genuine disconnect in America towards the outside world. While I obviously can't provide any personal insight because I'm not American, how he presents his characters and attitudes is still quite authentic and resonates in many ways with everyone, not just America. The film doesn't hold back from showing this uncaring, inconsequential attitude towards the characters' disruptive, xenophobic, sexist, and far too frequently homophobic behaviour, which does go a little too far at times. You know, some sympathetic qualities would have helped me care a bit more. Just saying. Naturally, it makes it hard to root for them, but my curiosity was always wrapped up in seeing this mysterious underworld play out because it is left largely ambiguous to us. Of course, I was never so distasteful of the characters that I wanted to see them get tortured, proving a certain moral thematic challenge exists within it, but seeing it as an openly ignorant exploration of another side of humanity outside our comfort zones makes sense in the context of the massive hole the characters keep digging for themselves in a world that they perceive as strange. Put it this way, if we're seeing the film as this ugly representation of disrespectful tourists, the fact that a good chunk of the characters' time is spent with their terrible lack of self-awareness towards the places they are, because they're on a constant hunt for pussy, it plays alternate to this general fear of being in a place foreign to you, and being afraid of breaking their rules or facing unknowingly harsh punishment thanks to your ignorance. I mean, just look at that real-world story of that American kid that got imprisoned in North Korea. There is a powerful sense of alienation and discomfort to the atmosphere, and it's less to do with the foreshadowed evil and more to do with these characters lacking any diligence to the strangers they meet. The main leader of the group, Paxton, is the one that pushes them indirectly down this dangerous road in the first place out of excitement and willingness to go with the flow. And while normally that liberating feeling of travel is admirable as they describe, Roth presents that haunting subversion that you still need to keep your wits about you. I.e., don't be a dumbass and fuck with another country's method of order. Unlike Paxton, the other American Josh does bring a certain remorsefulness and borderline self-awareness to his behaviour, constantly feeling insecure about his experience that I'm sure many people can empathise with, while their Icelandic friend Ollie is revealed to just be some random guy they met on their travels who has a kid back home, thus perpetuating that feeling that these two Americans have absolutely no idea who they're with or even where they are. That's why I feel the torture rooms give off this hellish vibe. It's like they're wandering in an existential purgatory awaiting their turn for punishment for their sins or something like that. Even Josh tries to apologize to the guy that would end up killing him eventually, showing it's symbolically too late to turn back, making their travel all the more haunting. I never got past this sense of symbolism, especially when the film ends with no resolution to the conflict, only this nihilistic void of defeat and despair. There's no explanation, purpose, or reason given to why Paxton becomes the sole survivor, because in any other story he would usually be the first one to go. I like to think of the ending as this twisted fate that he now has to live with the psychological torture of his ignorance that got his friends killed. You could say it's a moral lesson, or you could say it's a punishment where he's left in a continuous limbo of his guilty actions, which is actually carried into the opening of the sequel. Okay, so I suppose I should probably explain what is actually going on in the film. So basically, this torture society are an exclusive club of wealthy thrill seekers who pay big money so that they can torture and kill random people. Paxton and his friends are encouraged by another random stranger in their hostel to visit a specific location in Slovakia where all their lusts and desires will be fulfilled by beautiful women, again heightening this spiritual feeling that they've made it to heaven as if they're backpacking on a boner pilgrimage, only to discover this club pays representatives to find new prey, including bribing the police to overlook tourist disappearances, so overall their operation, while not explained to us, appears exceedingly meticulous in the background information. The killer's reasoning is thus ultimately up to them. For some, they're probably just psychopaths without empathy, even if they have normal family lives outside their insane hobby, like the unnamed Dutch businessman who obsesses over this unfulfilled dream of wanting to be a surgeon, while for others like Louis Litt from Suits, it's about the thrill of a new experience. Again, it reflects this unfulfillment similar to Paxton and his friends. Both parties have travelled the world and seen everything it has to offer, that they now figuratively and literally lust for that liberating adrenaline rush that's now missing. Motive is essentially broad because, like I said earlier, there's no face to this organisation, no grand secret leader, just a club, thus making the horror feel all the more palpable. Now, the sequel goes down the obvious inevitable route of not just replicating the same plot by flipping male protagonists for females, but overemphasizing the torture scenes to the point of making it seem more cult-like than club-like, and adding a villainous face to the organisation, thus diminishing the believability slightly. And it also gives perspective to two club members. This part does have an interesting angle to show how creepily normalised this club is, and does add some interesting world-building ideas, like having a bid against other people to secure a specific victim, and pointing out how the clients are contractually obligated to finish what they started or risk their own lives. That said, none of this information is technically relevant when it's all implied in the first film anyway, or at least is something you could just ponder your imagination over, much like how the horror is set up in the first film, but hey, at least it's nowhere near as awful as the third direct-to-video film that, like the Saw series, dismisses the story and Roth's creative vision to focus on the flashy, tasteless violence, yet without the schlocky fun of the Saw series. I will end by saying the second film has a pretty brilliant conclusion where the main character Beth is established to have a massive inheritance from her mother, which at first just seems like a random character point, but to escape this ordeal, she offers to buy her freedom in exchange that she becomes a member as well, allowing her to seek revenge on the person that persuaded them to go to Slovakia in the first place. Oh, and also, the fittingly morbid conclusion to Paxton's storyline where the society track him down again is a nice piece of world building that makes you nervously question the reach and power of this organisation. In conclusion, I hope this gives those unfamiliar with HOSTEL an understanding of its status in horror cinema. I remember it being a significant talking point in the debates surrounding violence and censorship in cinema, even if it's pretty tame in comparison to the films that inspired it. Yet, its harrowing sense of realism shouldn't be undermined by its mean-spirited violence because, after all, there are many fucked up secret societies out there. Ironically, Hollywood. In short, Hostel captured a sinister side of humanity through what is effectively a niche horror movie that somehow made its way into the mainstream. It somewhat introduced common audiences to the more aggressive aspect of the genre that's long existed, but is one that hides in the shadow of horror films designed not to upset the masses, but simply poke them in the ribs as a method of provocation, rather than challenging them emotionally and, like the characters of Hostel, pulling them out of their comfort zones to embrace the genuine horrors of reality that, in some way, help us make sense of this crazy world. Hello to the brave few who made it to the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. As you can tell, YouTube hates it when I cover anything that's got sensitive, violent, or taboo subject matter, so I wouldn't be surprised if this video gets immediately demonetized, but you can't tell with the way YouTube is these days. So if you want to support the show, help me to grow it, please do consider heading over to Patreon, where for just a few dollars a month you can get early access, you can get your name in the credits, you can vote on what the next video could be, very much like this one. I would love to cover more videos like this, so if you have any recommendations, leave them in the comments below. You can even get access to our exclusive Discord chat, where you can tell me what you've been watching, playing, reading, share your thoughts on all obscure and iconic forms of media, even share your own work with me, because that's awesome as well. And until next time, head over to Instagram and Twitter. I'm on those platforms as well. Stay safe. Very safe. Careful where you go these days. And I'll see you all very soon. Bye.